The judge sentenced me to life in prison. From the gallery, I saw my wife Linda kissing my former business partner. It was a cruel, public betrayal. Rot in prison, loser, she whispered to him with a sickening smile. They had framed me. As the guards led me away, my 6-year-old son slipped a note into my palm. I opened it later in my cell. Don't worry, Dad. Wait for 12 days only. I fixed everything. I had no idea what he meant, or what would happen after. David Mathis adjusted his safety goggles as the industrial press thundered to life. Its massive hydraulic arms crushing another sheet of steel into shape. The Riverside manufacturing plant had been his workplace for 3 years. Now a far cry from the covert operations that had once defined his existence. The rhythmic hammering of metal echoed through the cavernous factory floor, a steady heartbeat that had become the soundtrack to his new life. At 42, David carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen the world's darkest corners and emerged scarred but unbroken. His colleagues knew him as a reliable worker who kept to himself, always punctual, never complaining. What they didn't know was that beneath his blue work shirt lay a tattoo that would make hardened criminals cross the street. A black serpent coiled around a dagger. The mark of Echo Division, the most classified unit in military black operations. Mathis, the voice of Ryan Thompson, the plant manager, cut through the industrial noise. At 38, Thompson was everything David appeared not to be. Polished, ambitious, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a suit that cost more than most workers made in a month. He'd been promoted to plant manager just 6 months ago, bringing with him new policies and a condescending attitude toward the floor workers. David looked up, wiping sweat from his brow. Yeah, boss. Linda needs to see you in HR, Thompson said, his thin, practiced smile not reaching his eyes. Something about your benefits package. There was something in his gaze that David's trained instincts immediately flagged the look of a predator sizing up prey. David nodded and made his way toward the administrative offices, passing through the maze of machinery and conveyor belts. The factory employed nearly 200 people, and David knew most of them by name. They were good people, hard-working folks who depended on their jobs to feed their families. It was one of the reasons he'd chosen this place after leaving his former life behind. Linda Riley, now Linda Mathis, sat behind her desk in the HR office. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a professional bun. At 35, she was still beautiful, though something had changed in her demeanor over the past few months. Where once there had been warmth in her green eyes when she looked at him, now there was something else. Distance, calculation. David, sit down, she said, without looking up from her computer. We need to discuss some changes to your health insurance coverage. He studied his wife of 8 years as she spoke about deductibles and coverage limits. They had met at a coffee shop in town back when he was transitioning out of his military career. She had been working as a paralegal then, ambitious and kind. Their courtship had been swift, and their marriage had been the anchor that helped him find stability in civilian life. But lately, she had been different. Working late, taking calls in private, coming home with the scent of expensive cologne that didn't belong to him. David's training had taught him to notice details others missed, and Linda had been providing plenty of details to notice. Is that all? He asked when she finished her rehearsed speech. She finally looked at him, and for a moment, he saw a flicker of guilt or regret. It disappeared quickly, replaced by professional detachment. That's all for now. I'll have the new paperwork ready by Friday. As David walked back to the factory floor, he passed Thompson's office. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap, he could see the man on the phone, speaking in low, urgent tones. David's enhanced hearing, honed by years of surveillance work, caught fragments of the conversation. Has to look like an accident. Industrial press tonight would be perfect. David kept walking, his expression unchanged, but his mind was already working. In Echo Division, survival had depended on processing threats and formulating responses in seconds. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Back at his station, David continued his work, but his awareness had shifted into combat mode. Every sound, every movement around him was catalogued and analyzed. He noticed how Thompson kept glancing in his direction. He observed Linda through the glass partition of the HR office. Seeing how she checked her phone every few minutes and how her fingers drummed nervously on her desk. During his lunch break, David made his way to the parking lot and circled around to the back of the building, where the loading docks were located. Using skills that most civilians didn't possess, he accessed the building's ventilation system. and made his way to a position above Thompson's office. The conversation he overheard would have shocked most people. David simply absorbed it, filing away every detail for future use. "My husband's a washed-up factory worker," Linda's voice carried clearly through the thin office walls. "Crush him in the industrial press tonight. No one will question a workplace accident." Thompson's response was equally chilling. "Are you sure about this, Linda? There's no going back once we ... I'm tired of pretending to love him," she snapped. "You promised me we'd be together once he was out of the picture. His life insurance policy will set us up nicely, and with my administrative access, I can make sure the safety protocols show equipment malfunction. What about the investigation? I'll handle the paperwork." David was always careless around machinery. That's what the reports will show. A tragic accident, nothing more. David had heard enough. He made his way back to his station, his mind already formulating a plan. These people had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw a simple factory worker, a man they could manipulate and discard. They had never looked closely at the tattoo on his shoulder, never questioned why a man with his education and bearing was content to work a blue-collar job. That was their first mistake. It would also be their last. As the afternoon shift wound down, David noticed the increased activity around his workstation. Thompson had been by 3 times, checking on safety protocols. Linda had visited the floor twice, something she rarely did. The maintenance crew had also made several suspicious adjustments to the industrial press he operated. David smiled to himself as he cleaned his station. 20 years in Echo Division had taught him that the best defense was often a superior offense. These amateurs thought they were setting a trap. They had no idea they were walking into one. As he prepared to clock out, David caught Thompson's eye across the factory floor. The younger man nodded slightly, a gesture that was meant to seem casual but carried darker implications. David nodded back, playing his role as the oblivious husband who would soon meet his end. Too bad they never looked closely at his tattoo, the mark of the deadliest operative in Black Ops. They had no idea he was about to put them through the real hell. David Mathis sat in his pickup truck in the factory parking lot, engine off, watching the building through his rearview mirror. Most of the day shift had gone home, but Thompson's BMW and Linda's Honda remained. They were probably inside, right now, finalizing their murderous plan. He pulled out an encrypted cell phone, a relic from his previous life that he'd kept for emergencies. With practiced fingers, he dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. "Code word verification," came the gruff voice on the other end. "Echo 77. Request immediate background sweep." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. "Echo 77. This is Control. Your clearance was revoked upon discharge. Override, Crimson Protocol. Personal threat assessment." Crimson Protocol was reserved for situations where an Echo operative's cover had been blown and civilian casualties were imminent. It gave him temporary access to military intelligence resources. Another pause, longer this time. "Verified. What do you need, David?" "Complete background on Ryan Michael Thompson, age 38. Current residence 1247 Oakwood Drive, and Linda Marie Riley, maiden name, age 35. My current spouse. Priority flagged. Give me 20 minutes." David ended the call and began preparing for the evening ahead. From a hidden compartment beneath his truck's bench seat, he retrieved a small tactical kit, lockpicks, surveillance devices, and a ceramic knife that wouldn't trigger metal detectors, items that most people would never recognize. But that could mean the difference between life and death. His phone buzzed with an incoming text. The information he'd requested had arrived as encrypted files. What he read made his blood run cold. Ryan Thompson wasn't just an ambitious plant manager. He was the son of Richard Thompson, a former Echo Division commander who had been dishonorably discharged 15 years ago for selling classified information to foreign agents. The younger Thompson had been investigated twice by military intelligence for suspicious contacts with known arms dealers. But charges were never filed due to lack of evidence. Linda's file was equally revealing. Before becoming Linda Riley, she had been Linda Marie Castellano, daughter of Vincent Castellano, a mid-level crime family operator who specialized in insurance fraud. She had legally changed her name at age 25, shortly after her father's conviction for racketeering. Her paralegal credentials were legitimate, but her employment history showed a pattern of accessing confidential information that had later been compromised. David stared at his phone screen, pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. Their meeting hadn't been a coincidence. Their marriage wasn't built on love. He had been marked from the beginning, targeted by professionals who knew exactly what they were doing. The factory's night shift was smaller, only about 40 workers to maintain essential operations. David knew the building's layout intimately, not just from his 3 years of employment, but from the detailed reconnaissance he'd conducted during his first week. Old habits from Echo Division died hard. At 9 p.m., David made his move. He entered the building through a service entrance most employees didn't know existed. Using a master keycard he'd cloned months earlier, his footsteps were silent as he made his way through the darkened corridors toward the administrative section. Thompson's office was empty, but David could hear voices coming from the conference room down the hall. Through the partially open door, he could see Linda and Thompson hunched over building schematics, pointing at specific locations and discussing timing. The press operates on a 15-minute cycle, Thompson was saying. If David's working the late shift tonight, we can trigger a malfunction at exactly 10:47 p.m. The safety systems will show a mechanical failure, and the hydraulic pressure will do the rest. What about the security cameras? Linda asked. I've already arranged for a technical glitch in the recording system. The footage will show static for that exact time frame. Very convenient. David moved closer, his training allowing him to remain invisible in the shadows. He activated a small recording device and captured their entire conversation, evidence that would be useful later. There's just one thing that bothers me, Linda continued. David's been acting strange, lately more alert, like he's watching us. Thompson laughed. He's a factory worker, Linda. These blue-collar types aren't exactly criminal masterminds. He probably suspects you're having an affair. Nothing more. Maybe, but there's something about him. Sometimes, when I look at him, I see something in his eyes, like he's calculating, analyzing. You're overthinking this. By tomorrow morning, David Mathis will be yesterday's news, and we'll be planning our new life together. David had heard enough. He retreated through the corridors and made his way to the factory floor. The night shift supervisor, Hal Lake, was making his rounds. David had worked with Hal during several overtime shifts and knew him to be a decent man with a wife and 3 kids. Hey, Hal, David called out as he approached. David, what are you doing here? You're not scheduled tonight. That's what I need to talk to you about. I got a call from Thompson about an hour ago. He wants me to run a special job on Press 4. Said it was a rush order for a big client. Hal frowned. That's weird. I didn't get any paperwork about a special job, and Press 4 has been acting up lately. Maintenance tagged it for service tomorrow. That's what I thought was strange, too. Mind if I take a look at the work orders? They walked to Hall's office, where David quickly scanned the duty roster and maintenance reports. As expected, there was no legitimate work order for Press 4, but there were several maintenance notes about hydraulic pressure irregularities that had developed over the past week. Now, I need to ask you a favor, David said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. I want you to take your crew and do a complete safety inspection of Press 4 right now. Document everything. Hydraulic pressure, safety interlocks, emergency shutdown systems. Why? What's going on, David? Someone's been tampering with that machine, and they're planning to use it to hurt somebody tonight. Hal's expression darkened. Are you serious? Who would? I can't explain everything right now, but I need you to trust me. And Hal, whatever you do, don't let anyone else near that press until the police arrive. Police? David, what the hell is going on? Just trust me, and when they ask you questions later, tell them exactly what you found during your inspection. Document everything. David left Hal to his work and positioned himself in a concealed location overlooking the factory floor. At 10:30 p.m., Thompson appeared, dressed in dark clothing and moving with the careful steps of someone who didn't want to be seen. He made his way directly to Press 4. David watched through night vision goggles as Thompson accessed the machine's control panel. The man clearly knew what he was doing. His movements were practiced and professional. Within minutes, he had bypassed several safety systems and adjusted the hydraulic pressure to dangerous levels. At exactly 10:47 p.m., Thompson triggered the press's emergency cycle. The massive machine roared to life, its hydraulic arm slamming down with tremendous force. If David had been standing in his normal position, he would have been crushed instantly. Instead, Thompson found himself staring at an empty workstation. And then he heard slow, deliberate applause coming from behind him. David stepped out of the shadows, his hands clapping mockingly. Very impressive, Ryan. Your father would be proud. Of course, Richard Thompson always was better at betraying people than actually killing them. Thompson spun around, his face pale with shock. How do you, ... Who are you? David smiled, and for the first time, Thompson saw something in his eyes that made him take an involuntary step backward. I'm the man you tried to murder tonight. But more importantly, I'm Echo 77, and you just made the biggest mistake of your miserable life. Chapter 3. The Hunter's Web. The industrial press continued its deadly cycle. Hydraulic arms crushing empty air where David should have been standing. Thompson backed away from the machine, his face a mask of confusion and growing terror as David's words sank in Asho 77. Thompson's voice cracked. That's impossible. You're just a washed-up factory worker. David's smile was predatory. That's what your girlfriend called me. My husband's a washed-up factory worker, she said. Crush him in the industrial press tonight. No one will question a workplace accident. Thompson's eyes widened. You heard. I heard everything. David began walking toward him with measured steps. I know about your father, Richard. I know about Linda's real family connections. I know this whole thing was a setup from the beginning. Wait, David, let me explain. Explain. David's voice turned ice cold. You want to explain how you seduced my wife. How you planned my murder. How you thought you could outsmart a man who spent 20 years hunting enemies of the state. Thompson bumped against a support beam, trapped. His hand moved toward his jacket pocket, but David was faster. In one fluid motion, he crossed the distance between them and pinned Thompson's arm against the steel beam. I wouldn't, David said quietly. Whatever weapon you're reaching for won't help you now. From his own pocket, David produced his phone and played back the recording he'd made earlier. Thompson's and Linda's voices filled the air, detailing their murderous plan with chilling clarity. You see, Ryan, the thing about being in Black Ops is that you learn to always have a backup plan. And sometimes a backup for the backup. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Thompson's face went white. You called the police. I called several people. The police are just the beginning. Hal Lake appeared at the far end of the factory floor, accompanied by 2 uniformed officers and a detective. David, everything all right over here? Just fine, Hal. Mr. Thompson here was just demonstrating how he sabotaged the press. Isn't that right, Ryan? The detective, a weathered man in his 50s named Clint Fuller, approached with his hand resting on his service weapon. Sir, I'm Detective Fuller. We received a report about attempted murder and industrial sabotage. David handed over his recording device and a manila envelope he'd prepared. Everything you need is there, Detective. Audio recording of the conspiracy, maintenance records showing the sabotage, and background information on both suspects. Detective Fuller's eyebrows rose as he scanned the documents. This is very thorough, Mr. Mathis, almost like you knew this was going to happen. I had my suspicions, David replied. When you've been married to someone for 8 years, you notice when they start planning your funeral. Where's Mrs. Mathis now? Probably in her office, waiting for confirmation that her husband is dead. She was supposed to handle the paperwork, make sure the accident looked legitimate. Detective Fuller nodded to his officers. Johnson, secure this area as a crime scene. Martinez, let's go collect Mrs. Mathis. As the police led Thompson away in handcuffs, the man looked back at David with a mixture of fear and hatred. You think this is over? You have no idea what you're dealing with. David's expression didn't change. Actually, Ryan, I know exactly what I'm dealing with. The question is, do you? 30 minutes later, Linda was escorted onto the factory floor in handcuffs, her professional composure completely shattered. When she saw David standing calmly beside the press, she thought had killed him. Her legs nearly gave out. David, but how? You were supposed to be dead. David stepped closer to his wife, his soon-to-be ex-wife. Sorry to disappoint you, Linda, or should I say Linda Castellano. I have to admit, you played the role of loving wife very well. For 8 years, I actually believed you cared about me. Linda's eyes darted between David and the police officers. I don't know what Ryan told you, but Linda, you did. David pulled out another recording device. Would you like to hear your own voice discussing how to murder your husband? The part where you called me a washed-up factory worker was particularly touching. As her recorded words filled the air, Linda's face crumpled. David, please, you have to understand, my family. I understand perfectly. You married me because your family needed someone with a clean background to help with their operations. You thought you'd found an easy mark, a simple military veteran who'd be grateful for your attention. Detective Fuller stepped between them. Mr. Mathis, we'll need you to come to the station tomorrow to give a full statement. Mrs. Mathis, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, and industrial sabotage. As the police vehicles pulled away with their prisoners, Hal Lake approached David. Jesus, David, I had no idea. All this time, you seemed so normal. David smiled grimly. I am normal, Hal. I'm just normal with some very specialized training. What happens now? Now. David looked around the factory floor at the machines that had been his world for 3 years. Now I start over again. But even as he spoke the words, David knew it wouldn't be that simple. The recording he'd made of Thompson's threats echoed in his mind. You think this is over? You have no idea what you're dealing with. David had spent 20 years in Echo Division, learning that enemies rarely traveled alone. Thompson and Linda were just the visible part of a larger network. And somewhere out there, people were going to be very unhappy that their carefully laid plan had failed. As he walked to his truck, David noticed a black sedan parked across the street from the factory. The windows were tinted, and it had been there when he'd arrived earlier, but it had moved since then. Professional surveillance. David got into his truck but didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, he used his rearview mirror to study the sedan. 2 occupants, both alert and focused on him. The license plate was government issued. His encrypted phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Impressive work tonight, but the game is just beginning. Vincent Castellano sends his regards. David stared at the message, then deleted it. Linda's father was supposed to be in federal prison, but clearly his reach extended far beyond the prison walls. The attempt on David's life hadn't been just about insurance money or a love triangle. It had been about eliminating someone who posed a threat to a much larger operation. As David finally started his truck and drove away, he caught one last glimpse of the black sedan in his mirror. It didn't follow him, but he knew that didn't matter. They knew where he lived, where he worked, probably everything about his routine. The factory worker, David Mathis, was dead, killed in that industrial press along with his old life. What emerged from that factory floor was something else entirely. Echo 77. And he was about to remind some very dangerous people why operatives like him were given numbers instead of names. The war was just beginning. 3 days after Linda and Thompson's arrest, David received word that both suspects had been released on bail. Their lawyer was Angelica Wise, known for defending high-profile organized crime figures. The bail had been set at $2 million each, money that should have been impossible for a factory manager and HR administrator to raise. But David wasn't surprised. He'd been expecting this. He sat in his kitchen reviewing files spread across the table. Using his Echo Division contacts, he'd compiled a complete dossier on the Castellano crime family. Vincent Castellano might be in federal prison, but his organization was very much alive. His eldest son, Antonio McDowell, who had taken his stepfather's name to distance himself from the family business, ran legitimate construction companies that served as fronts for money laundering and contract killing. The family had been trying to expand their operations into the Midwest for years, but they needed clean financial channels and someone with administrative access to facilitate their activities. Linda's marriage to David had been part of a long-term infiltration plan. David's phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Fuller. Mr. Mathis, I thought you should know. Both suspects made bail this morning. We did everything we could to keep them locked up, but their lawyer filed motions claiming insufficient evidence. What about the recordings? Their attorney claims they were obtained illegally. Without a warrant, they might not be admissible. I'm sorry, David. The system doesn't always work the way it should. After ending the call, David sat quietly for several minutes. The legal system had failed him, just as it had failed countless others who'd crossed paths with organized crime. But David had never relied solely on the legal system for justice. He opened his laptop and began typing, accessing databases that officially didn't exist. Within hours, he had current addresses, phone numbers, daily routines, and security arrangements for everyone involved. Linda was staying at a safe house, owned by one of Antonio McDowell's shell companies. Thompson had returned to his apartment, but with 2 bodyguards, professionals with military backgrounds. But David wasn't interested in quick, simple justice. These people had spent months planning his death, treating him like a disposable obstacle. They deserved something more elaborate. The next morning, David drove to the construction site where Antonio McDowell's company was building a new shopping center. McDowell himself was there. A tall, well-dressed man in his 40s who looked more like a Wall Street executive than a crime family heir. David observed him from a distance, noting his bodyguards, his routine, his vulnerabilities. That afternoon, David visited 3 different locations in the city, making seemingly random purchases. Electronic components from a hobby shop, industrial chemicals from a janitorial supply company, precision tools from a machine shop. To anyone watching, he appeared to be a man getting on with his life after a traumatic experience. But to someone with Echo Division training, he was assembling the components for something far more sinister. On Thursday evening, Linda called him. David let it go to voicemail, then listened to her message. "David, please, we need to talk. I know you're angry, but there are things you don't understand. My family, they're not people you can just walk away from. They're coming for you, and I'm the only one who can protect you. Meet me at the old steel mill on Route 47 tomorrow night at 10 p.m. Come alone, and I'll explain everything." David played the message 3 times, analyzing every word, every inflection. It was clearly a trap, but it was also an opportunity. Linda thought she was luring him to his death. Instead, she was walking into his Friday night. David arrived at the abandoned steel mill 2 hours early. The facility had been closed for 15 years, its massive structures left to rust in the industrial wasteland outside town. It was the perfect place for the kind of meeting that ended with someone disappearing permanently. Using his night vision equipment, David conducted a thorough reconnaissance of the area. He counted 6 men positioned around the property, professionals with military-grade weapons. Linda and Thompson were in the main office building, along with 2 additional guards. David smiled grimly. They brought an army to kill one washed-up factory worker. At exactly 9:45 p.m., David's preparations were complete. He'd spent the past week studying the abandoned facility's layout, identifying structural weaknesses, and placing small charges in strategic locations. Nothing that would cause a massive explosion. David was more subtle than that. Instead, he'd created a series of carefully calculated collapses that would appear to be the result of the old building finally succumbing to years of neglect. At 10 p.m., David walked openly toward the main office building, making no attempt at stealth. Let them think they had the advantage. Linda was waiting in what had once been the plant supervisor's office, wearing an expensive dress that looked out of place in the decrepit surroundings. Thompson stood beside her, looking nervous but trying to project confidence. 2 guards flanked the doorway. "Hello, Linda," David said calmly. "Nice dress. A little formal for a murder, don't you think?" "David, thank God you came. My family wants me dead." "I know." David looked around the office with apparent casual interest. "This is quite an elaborate setup. 6 shooters outside, 2 in here with you. Very professional." Linda's facade cracked slightly. "How do you know about the shooters?" "Same way I knew about your plan to kill me. Same way I know that Antonio McDowell is parked about a quarter mile away, waiting for confirmation that I'm dead." Thompson stepped forward. "You're surrounded, David. Just make this easy on everyone." David laughed a sound that made everyone in the room tense. "Easy, Ryan. You tried to murder me with an industrial press. You think I'm going to make anything easy for you?" One of the guards spoke into his radio. "Target is in position. Awaiting orders." The response crackled through the speaker. "Execute in 60 seconds. David checked his watch. 60 seconds. That's perfect timing. Linda frowned. "What are you?" Her words were cut off by a deep rumbling sound from somewhere below them. The building shook slightly, and dust rained from the ceiling. "What the hell was that?" Thompson demanded. David smiled. "That was the first support beam giving way. This building has been scheduled for demolition for months, but the city couldn't afford it. Funny how these old structures sometimes just collapse on their own." Another rumble, stronger this time. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness, broken only by the emergency lighting from the guards' equipment. "You son of a bitch," Linda snarled. "What did you do?" "I gave you what you wanted, Linda. A workplace accident. Only this time, it's going to be your accident." The building shook again, and they could hear shouting from outside as the perimeter guards realized what was happening. But David had cut their communication lines and disabled their vehicles. They were trapped in a collapsing industrial facility, with no way to call for help. "The support beams are going in a sequence," David explained conversationally as another section of the building groaned ominously. We have maybe 5 minutes before this whole place comes down. Plenty of time to have the conversation you wanted. Thompson pulled out a gun, pointing it at David. You're insane. Get us out of here, or what? You'll shoot me in a collapsing building where my body will be crushed beyond recognition. That's not very smart, Ryan. The building lurched suddenly, and Thompson lost his balance. David was moving before the younger man hit the ground, disarming him with brutal efficiency. One of the guards tried to intervene, but David's combat training made the fight laughably one-sided. Within seconds, both guards were unconscious, and David held Thompson at knife point while Linda cowered against the far wall. Now, David said calmly as another section of the building collapsed with a thunderous crash. Let's discuss your family's plans for expansion into my territory. Linda's face was streaked with tears and dust. David, please, we can work this out. I never wanted this. You never wanted what? To murder your husband. You seemed pretty enthusiastic about it on the recording. The building shook violently, and cracks appeared in the walls around them. David calculated they had perhaps 2 minutes before this section became uninhabitable. I'm going to give you both a choice, David said, his voice barely audible, over the sounds of destruction. You can die here, crushed in an industrial accident just like you planned for me, or you can spend the rest of your lives knowing that I'm out there watching, waiting for you to make another mistake. What do you want? Thompson gasped. I want you to understand something. I want you to remember this moment every time you close your eyes. I am not a victim. I am not prey. I am the thing that monsters like you should be afraid of in the dark. David stood up, releasing Thompson. The exit is through the back corridor. You have 90 seconds before the roof collapses. I suggest you run. Linda and Thompson stumbled toward the door, but Linda stopped and looked back. This isn't over, David. My family will. Your family will do nothing, David interrupted. Because they're going to be too busy dealing with their own problems. As if summoned by his words, David's phone rang. He answered it calmly despite the chaos around them. Echo 77. David, this is Control. Operation Castellano is complete. Antonio McDowell and 6 associates were arrested 20 minutes ago on federal conspiracy charges. The family's financial network has been frozen, and warrants have been issued for 12 additional family members. David smiled at Linda's horrified expression. Perfect timing. Thank you, Control. The FBI wants a debrief on your involvement. Tell them I'll be in touch. David ended the call and looked at his wife and her lover. Run. They ran. David waited until the sound of their footsteps faded, then calmly walked to a different exit, one he'd prepared earlier that would lead him safely out of the building. Behind him, the steel mill continued its death throes, collapsing in sections, as his carefully placed charges severed key support structures. By the time the fire department arrived, the building was a pile of rubble. The official investigation would conclude that the structure had finally succumbed to years of neglect and weathering. 6 bodies would be found in the debris. Antonio McDowell's shooters, who hadn't been fast enough to escape David's trap. Linda and Thompson survived, but they emerged from the rubble broken and terrorized. Their criminal network was dismantled, their assets frozen, and their associates either dead or in federal custody. As David drove home through the quiet streets, he reflected on the evening's work. Justice had been served, but not in the way the legal system would have provided it. This was Echo Division justice, swift, final, and absolute. His phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We know what you did. This isn't over. David deleted the message without reading it a second time. There would always be someone looking for revenge. Always another threat to deal with, but that was fine with him. After 20 years in Black Ops, he'd learned that peace was just the interval between wars, and David Mathis was very, very good at war. 2 weeks after the steel mill incident, David received news that would change everything. Detective Fuller called with an update that made his blood run cold. David, I thought you should know. Linda and Thompson were found dead in their safe house this morning. Professional hit. Very clean. Single shots to the head. No signs of struggle. David sat in silence for a moment. Any suspects? Well, that's the interesting part. The house was owned by a shell company linked to the Castellano family. But here's the thing. Our investigation shows the hit was ordered from inside federal prison. Vincent Castellano apparently decided his daughter had become a liability. After ending the call, David stared out his kitchen window at the quiet suburban street. Linda and Thompson were dead, killed by the very people they'd served. It should have felt like justice, but instead it felt like loose ends being tied up. In David's experience, when a crime family started eliminating their own people, it meant they were preparing for something bigger. His encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Control. Echo 77. Immediate extraction recommended. Multiple threats inbound to your location. David looked around his modest home, the place he'd shared with Linda for 8 years. Everything here was contaminated now, tainted by lies and betrayal. He packed a single bag with essentials and prepared to disappear. But as he reached for his car keys, David paused. Running was what the old David would have done, the factory worker who just wanted a quiet life. But the events of the past few weeks had awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. He wasn't David Mathis, factory worker, anymore. He was Echo 77. And Echo operatives didn't run from fights. Instead of fleeing, David made a phone call to an old contact, Santiago Meyer. The voice on the other end was cautious, professional. It's 77. Jesus, David. Heard you were out of the game. I was. Circumstances changed. I need intelligence on Vincent Castellano's current operations. Everything. Money flow, ongoing contracts. That's heavy stuff. Brother Castellano's got federal protection as a witness. He also just ordered the execution of his own daughter. I don't think his witness protection is going to last much longer. Santiago was quiet for a moment. Give me 6 hours. And David, whatever you're planning, be careful. Word is, there's a bounty on your head. $500,000, dead or alive. Who posted it? That's the strange part. It came from outside the family. Someone with serious money and serious connections. After ending the call, David began preparing his house for what he knew was coming. If someone had put a bounty on his head, professional killers would be arriving soon. This time, he would be ready. He spent the next 4 hours turning his suburban home into a fortress, using skills learned in hostile territories around the world. David created overlapping fields of fire, established escape routes, and prepared defensive positions. To any observer, the house looked normal, but to someone with David's training, it had become a killing field. At sunset, they came. David spotted the first team through his surveillance equipment. 3 men in a van parked 2 blocks away. Professional setup, good equipment, but they made the mistake of thinking they were hunting a civilian. The second team approached from the backyard, moving with military precision through the neighbors' properties. David counted for men, all carrying suppressed weapons. The third team was the most dangerous, a sniper positioned in a house across the street with a clear line of sight to David's front door. 7 professional killers, all focused on one target. In the old days, Echo Division would have called this unfavorable odds. David called it a target-rich environment. He triggered the first trap as the backyard team reached his fence. The explosion was small but precisely placed, taking out the 2 rearguards without alerting the other teams. The remaining 2 men from that team rushed toward the house, thinking their comrades had triggered an alarm system. They ran straight into David's crossfire. The sniper across the street realized something was wrong when his radio went silent. David watched through his scope as the man shifted position, trying to get a better angle on the house. But David had already anticipated this move. The sniper never saw the remote control device that David had placed in the attic across the street earlier that day. The small explosion brought down part of the roof, eliminating the threat permanently. That left the 3-man team in the van. They were the smartest of the bunch, staying mobile and using their vehicle as both transportation and cover. David could hear them on their radios, trying to coordinate with teams that no longer existed. David walked out his front door and stood in his driveway, completely exposed. The van's engine roared to life, and it accelerated toward him, the passenger window rolling down as the gunman prepared to fire. David didn't move, didn't take cover. He simply raised his own weapon and put 3 rounds through the windshield. The van veered off the road and crashed into a fire hydrant, water geysering into the evening sky. David walked calmly to the wreckage and checked on the occupants. All 3 were alive but unconscious. Good. He needed at least one of them conscious for questioning. 20 minutes later, the survivor, a professional killer named Hayato Washburn, was tied to a chair in David's garage, blood trickling from a head wound. Who sent you? David asked conversationally. Washburn spat blood. Go to hell. David showed him a photograph. Washburn's daughter at her college graduation. Beautiful girl pre-med at Northwestern. Right? Excellent grades. bright future. Washburn's eyes widened with fear. You touch her, and You'll what? You're tied to a chair, and your team is dead. But I'm not interested in hurting innocents, Hayata. I just want you to understand that I know everything about you. Your daughter. Your ex-wife in Phoenix. Your brother who runs that restaurant in Chicago. I could make all of them disappear, but I won't. If you answer my questions. Washburn sagged in his chair. The contract came through a broker. High-end stuff, very exclusive clientele. Who's the client? I don't know. It was handled through intermediaries, but the money came from overseas accounts. Very sophisticated operation. How much? $2 million. Half up front, half on confirmation of death. David whistled softly. Someone really wanted him dead. What else? There's more teams coming. This was just the first wave. Whoever wants you gone has serious resources. David untied Washburn and handed him a cell phone. You're going to call your broker and tell them the contract is complete. David Mathis is dead, killed in the firefight. You're the only survivor. Why would you? Because you're going to disappear after that call. New identity, new life. Far away from here. Your daughter won't have to know her father was a killer for hire. Washburn stared at him in confusion. You're letting me go? I'm giving you a choice, Hayata, make the right choice. After Washburn left, David surveyed the carnage around his property. 6 bodies, a destroyed van, and enough evidence to keep CSI teams busy for weeks. But David wouldn't be here when they arrived. He placed a call to Detective Fuller, reporting a home invasion and multiple casualties. Then he gathered his few remaining possessions and walked away from the life of David Mathis forever. As he drove out of town, David's phone rang. Santiago Meyer had the intelligence he'd requested. Vincent Castellano isn't just a witness, Santiago reported. He's been running operations from federal prison through a network of corrupt guards and officials. The FBI is about to lose their star witness in a massive scandal. What kind of operations? International arms dealing, human trafficking, money laundering on a scale that makes his old family business look like a lemonade stand. But here's the interesting part. He's not running it alone. He's got partners, people with government connections. David felt the pieces clicking into place. Political connections. Higher than that, brother. This goes all the way to the top. David ended the call and drove through the night, his mind working on the implications. Linda and Thompson had been small players in a much larger game. The attempt on his life hadn't been about revenge or insurance money. It had been about eliminating someone who could potentially expose a network that reached into the highest levels of government. But they'd made one crucial mistake. They tried to kill Echo 77. And Echo operatives had a very specific response to attempts on their lives. Total warfare. As dawn broke over the interstate, David made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to run, and he wasn't going to hide. He was going to war against the entire network, no matter how high it reached or how powerful its members thought they were. The reckoning had begun, and it would not end until every person responsible for the betrayal was dead or destroyed. Behind him, smoke rose from the ruins of his old life. Ahead lay a path of vengeance that would make his previous actions look like practice runs. David Mathis was dead. What emerged from the wreckage was something far more dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose and all the skills necessary to take down anyone who stood in his way. David drove for 3 days straight, using back roads and rest stops, staying off the grid while his former life burned behind him. The news reports painted the incident at his house as a home invasion gone wrong. 6 professional criminals dead, homeowner David Mathis missing and presumed dead. Perfect. On the 4th day, he arrived at a cabin in the mountains of West Virginia, a safe house he'd established years ago during his Echo Division days. The property was registered to a deceased operative, untraceable to his current identity. Here, he could plan his next moves without interference. Santiago Meyer was waiting for him, as arranged. The 2 men had served together in Echo Division for 12 years before Santiago moved into private intelligence consulting. He was one of the few people David trusted completely. You look like hell, Santiago said, studying David's face. As he entered the cabin. Feel worse. What do you have for me? Santiago spread files across the kitchen table. Vincent Castellano's network is bigger than we thought. It's not just organized crime. It's a hybrid operation mixing crime families with corrupt government officials, defense contractors, and foreign intelligence agencies. David studied the organizational chart Santiago had prepared. Who's at the top? That's where it gets interesting. The money flows through a series of shell companies, but they all trace back to three main sources. First is Castellano's traditional crime operations. Second is a defense contractor called Meridian Systems. They have classified contracts with the DoD and CIA. And the third, Santiago's expression darkened. That's the problem. The third source appears to be a black-budget operation run by someone inside the intelligence community. Someone with access to Echo Division files. David looked up sharply. What do you mean? Someone leaked your real identity to the Castellanos. They knew exactly who you were when Linda targeted you for marriage. This wasn't random. They specifically chose an Echo operative to infiltrate. Why? Best guess, they needed someone with your clearance level and background to access something. Maybe classified information. Maybe to eliminate other operatives. But the plan was always to kill you once they got what they needed. David sat back, processing the implications. How long have I been under surveillance? Probably since you left Echo Division. Maybe longer. Jesus. Santiago pulled out another file. There's more. I've identified 12 other former Echo operatives who died in the past 5 years. All supposedly natural deaths or accidents. All of them married to women with connections to organized crime. David felt ice in his veins. A systematic elimination program. That's what it looks like. Someone is methodically hunting down Echo Division veterans and using their own wives to do it. Any survivors besides me? Maybe. I've lost contact with 3 operatives who were supposed to check in with their handlers. They might be dead, or they might have gone underground. David studied the photographs of his dead colleagues, men he'd served with, trusted, fought alongside. All dead because someone had decided that Echo Division veterans were a threat that needed to be eliminated. I want names, David said quietly. Everyone involved in this, every government official, every contractor, every crime family connection, all of them. David, this goes higher than we've ever operated. Some of these people have presidential access. I don't care if they have God's personal phone number. They killed my friends. They tried to kill me, and they're probably going to keep killing until someone stops them. Santiago nodded grimly. I thought you might say that. I've prepared 3 packages. Complete intelligence files on the major players, but David, if you go after these people, there's no coming back. You'll be at war with the United States government. Won't be the first time. Over the next several hours, Santiago briefed David on the network's key figures. At the top was Meridian Systems, a defense contractor run by a man named Darren House. House had been a CIA operative in the 1990s, before transitioning to private military contracting. His company had contracts worth billions of dollars, and he'd been using those resources to build a private intelligence network. Working with House was Senator Brian Gaines, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Gaines had access to all classified information about Echo Division, including personal files on every operative who'd ever served. He'd been providing that information to House's organization. The third major player was Lon McLaughlin, who worked as a senior analyst at CIA headquarters. McLaughlin had been using his position to identify Echo operatives who might pose a threat to the network's activities. They've been using crime families like the Castellanos as cutouts, Santiago explained. Keeps their hands clean while eliminating threats. What's the endgame? Near as I can tell, they're building a private military and intelligence capability that operates outside government oversight. Think of it as a shadow CIA, with no congressional oversight and unlimited funding. David stared at the files, his mind working through the implications. How many people are we talking about? Core leadership is maybe 50 people, but they've got resources across multiple agencies, crime families in 6 states, and international connections in 12 countries. Conservative estimate, they can field maybe 2,000 operatives if they need to, 2,000 against 1. Santiago smiled grimly. Those are better odds than some Echo missions we ran. David spent the next 2 days studying every file, memorizing faces, addresses, routines, and vulnerabilities. Then he began planning his campaign. The first target would be Lon McLaughlin, the CIA analyst who'd been providing intelligence on Echo operatives. McLaughlin lived alone in a Virginia suburb, worked regular hours, and had predictable habits. More importantly, he had access to the files that would tell David exactly which operatives were still alive and where they were located. On a Tuesday morning, David infiltrated McLaughlin's house while the man was at work. Using techniques learned in hostile territory, he accessed McLachlan's computer network and downloaded terabytes of classified information, but more importantly, he installed surveillance software that would give him real-time access to McLachlan's activities. What he discovered over the next 48 hours of surveillance made him sick. McLachlan wasn't just identifying targets for elimination. He was actively involved in planning the murders, coordinating with crime families, and covering up the evidence. The man had personally ordered the deaths of at least 23 Echopetiti. On Thursday night, David paid McLachlan a visit. The CIA analyst was watching television when David stepped out of his kitchen, having been waiting in the house for 3 hours. "Evening, Lon," David said calmly. "We need to talk." McLachlan reached for his service weapon, but David was faster. Within seconds, the analyst was zip-tied to his chair, staring into the eyes of a man he thought was dead. "You're David Mathis," McLachlan said, his voice shaking. "You're supposed to be dead. I got better. Now, let's discuss your hobby of murdering Echo operatives." Over the next hour, David extracted a complete confession from McLachlan. The man broke quickly, providing details about the entire network, including plans to eliminate the remaining Echo survivors. "There is a meeting tomorrow night," McLachlan sobbed. "All the major players will be there. They're planning the final phase of the operation. We're Meridian Systems headquarters. They think they've eliminated all the threats. They're going to celebrate." David smiled coldly. A celebration? How thoughtful of them. When David left McLachlan's house that night, the CIA analyst was still alive, but no longer capable of harming anyone. The surveillance software David had installed would record everything McLachlan did and said for the rest of his life, ensuring the man could never again work against Echo Division veterans. But more importantly, David now had the intelligence he needed to end this war in a single, decisive strike. Tomorrow night, everyone responsible for the deaths of his colleagues would be gathered in one location. They would be celebrating their success, feeling safe and secure in their victory. They had no idea that Echo 77 was about to turn their celebration into a funeral. The final reckoning was 24 hours away. The Meridian Systems headquarters occupied 40 floors of a gleaming Washington, D.C. office tower, a monument to the military-industrial complex's reach into American politics. From his surveillance position in an apartment building across the street, David watched through high-powered scopes as black sedans and limousines arrived at the building's executive entrance. It was 8 p.m. on a Friday night, and the building should have been empty except for security. Instead, it was hosting what Lon McLachlan had called the Victory Celebration, a gathering of everyone involved in the systematic elimination of Echo Division veterans. Through his listening devices, David monitored the conversations of arriving guests. Senator Brian Gaines stepped out of his armored limousine, speaking into his phone. "Yes, all 23 Echo targets have been neutralized. We can proceed with Phase 2. Defense contractor Darren House emerged from another vehicle, greeting associates with handshakes and laughter. "Gentlemen, tonight we celebrate the end of an era and the beginning of our new operations." David recognized other faces from Santiago's intelligence files: CIA executives, Pentagon officials, defense contractors, and crime family representatives. 53 people in total, all complicit in the murders of his colleagues. His encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Santiago. "Surveillance confirms no Echo survivors remain in federal databases. You're officially the last one." David stared at the message. The last Echo operative. Every other member of his unit was dead, killed by these people who were now celebrating in the tower across the street. He typed back, "Not for long." At 9 p.m., the celebration was in full swing. David could see through the tower's windows into the executive conference room, where his targets were gathered. Champagne flowed freely as they toasted their success and discussed their plans for expanded operations. What they didn't know was that David had spent the past week preparing this building for their arrival. Using maintenance access codes obtained from McLachlan's files, he'd infiltrated the tower's infrastructure. Elevators had been rigged to malfunction. Stairwell doors were prepared to lock automatically. Fire suppression systems had been modified. Security cameras were under his control. The Meridian Systems Tower had become an elegant trap, and everyone who'd participated in murdering Echo operatives was about to be caught in it. At 9:30 p.m., David initiated his plan. The building's lights went out floor by floor, starting from the bottom and working upward. Emergency lighting kicked in, but David controlled those systems, too. The executive floors where his targets were gathered remained illuminated a bright beacon in an otherwise darkened tower. Panic began immediately. David listened through his surveillance equipment as confused voices filled the executive conference room. What the hell happened to the power? Security report. What's your status? Elevators are down. We're trapped up here. Senator Gaines tried to take charge. Everyone remain calm. Building security will restore power shortly. But building security was in no position to help anyone. David had dealt with them first. Through the building's PA system, David's voice echoed through every floor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is Echo 77, and I have a message for everyone attending tonight's celebration. Silence fell over the executive conference room. David could see faces pressed against the windows, trying to locate the source of his voice. You've spent the past 5 years systematically murdering members of Echo Division. 23 of my colleagues are dead because you decided we were inconvenient witnesses to your crimes? Darren House grabbed a phone, trying to call for help, but David had cut all communications. You used our own wives to betray us. You turned our homes into killing fields. You thought you could eliminate us quietly, one by one, and no one would notice. David paused, watching the fear spread across the faces in the conference room. You were wrong. The building shuddered as the first of David's charges detonated. Not enough to bring down the structure, but sufficient to sever the building's connections to the outside world. Power lines, communication cables, water, mains all cut. The building is now completely isolated, David continued. No power, no communications, no water. The elevators are disabled, and the stairwell doors are locked. You are trapped 44 floors above ground, with no way to call for help. Panic erupted in the conference room. Some people ran for the doors. Others tried their cell phones. A few attempted to break the reinforced windows. But I'm not a monster, David said. I'm going to give you the same choice I gave everyone else who betrayed me. You can tell the truth about your crimes, or you can die here tonight. He activated the building's internet connection and projectors. Suddenly, every wall in the conference room displayed the same image. A live video feed of David sitting in the building's security center. I'm in the basement, 44 floors. Below you, I have complete control of this building's systems. I also have terabytes of classified information that document every murder you've committed, every crime you've covered up, every law you've broken. Senator Gaines stepped forward, trying to project authority. This is terrorism. You can't. I can do whatever I want. Senator, you see, you made one crucial error in your planning. You assumed that killing Echo operatives would be easy, because we're just soldiers following orders. But Echo Division operatives don't follow orders. We complete missions. David stood up in the security center, and the cameras tracked his movement. My mission is simple: ensure that everyone responsible for murdering my colleagues pays the price for their crimes. He walked to a control panel and placed his hand on a large red switch. This switch controls the building's emergency systems. If I throw it, every floor above the 20th will be flooded with halon gas, same fire suppressant that's supposed to protect your computer systems. Halon displaces oxygen. You'll have about 4 minutes before you lose consciousness. 6 minutes before permanent brain damage. 8 minutes before death. The conference room fell silent, except for the sound of panicked breathing. Alternatively, you can use the computer terminals in that room to type out complete confessions of your crimes. Every murder, every conspiracy, every act of treason. Upload them to the FBI database, and I'll consider letting some of you live. Darren House spoke up. You're bluffing. You can't murder 50 people and expect to get away with it. David smiled coldly at the camera. Mr. House, I spent 20 years murdering people for the United States government. I'm very good at it. The question is whether you're prepared to die for your crimes. Several people in the conference room moved toward the computer terminals, but House and Gaines tried to stop them. No one types anything. Gaines shouted. This is psychological warfare. He won't actually. David threw the switch. Halon gas began flooding into the executive floors. The conference room's ventilation system filled with the colorless, odorless gas that was designed to extinguish fires by removing oxygen from the air. You now have 8 minutes, David announced calmly. Choose wisely. Chaos erupted as people began typing frantically on the available terminals. Others tried to break down doors or smash windows. A few collapsed as the reduced oxygen levels affected them. Darren House and Senator Gaines held out longest, refusing to confess, even as their faces turned blue from oxygen deprivation. But eventually, survival instincts overcame loyalty to their conspiracy. One by one, detailed confessions appeared. On the FBI database, servers' admissions of murder, conspiracy, treason, and countless other crimes, evidence that would destroy careers, topple governments, and send dozens of powerful people to prison for life. When the last confession was uploaded, David turned off the halon gas and restored normal air circulation. "Congratulations," he announced. "You've all just confessed to federal crimes. The FBI will be very interested in reading your statements." But David wasn't finished. As the survivors in the conference room gasped for breath, he activated the final phase of his plan. "However, a confession doesn't equal absolution. You murdered 23 of my colleagues, 23 men who served their country with honor and died because you decided they were inconvenient." The building shuddered again as more charges detonated, this time severing key structural supports on selected floors. "I'm going to give you the same death you gave them, a seemingly accidental tragedy that no one will question." The Meridian Systems Tower began to collapse, but not all at once. David had calculated the demolition to pancake specific floors, while leaving others intact. The executive levels where his targets were gathered would be crushed, but the lower floors would remain stable enough for rescue teams to eventually recover the evidence of their crimes. As David walked out of the building's basement, he could hear the thunder of collapsing concrete and steel above him. By the time he reached the street, the upper floors of the Meridian Systems Tower were gone, reduced to rubble that would take weeks to clear. The official investigation would conclude that structural failure caused the collapse, a tragic accident that killed 53 people attending a business meeting. The confessions uploaded to the FBI database would be dismissed as fabrications created under duress, but the network responsible for murdering Echo Division operatives was completely destroyed. The men and women who had planned and executed those killings were dead. Their organization shattered, their resources scattered. David stood across the street from the ruins of the tower, watching emergency vehicles arrive and rescue teams begin their futile search for survivors. His phone buzzed with a message from Santiago. "FBI databases show all Echo operative files have been declassified and released to the press. The whole story is going public." David smiled grimly. Even in death, his targets had served a purpose. Their confessions would expose the entire conspiracy, ensuring that no one else would suffer the fate of the Echo Division veterans. The war was over. The reckoning was complete. But as David walked away from the destruction, he knew this was only the end of one battle. There would always be people who thought they could use and discard men like him. There would always be those who believed that power meant they were untouchable. They would learn otherwise. Echo 77 was no longer David Mathis, factory worker. He was something else now: judge, jury, and executioner for those who preyed on the people who served their country. And he would be watching, waiting in the shadows, for the next group of predators who needed to learn that some people couldn't be bought, betrayed, or broken. The mark of the serpent and dagger was more than just a tattoo. It was a promise of retribution that would follow anyone who dared to betray that trust forever. 6 months after the Meridian Systems Tower collapsed, David sat in a small cafe in Prague, reading news reports about the ongoing investigation. The FBI had recovered enough evidence from the building's database servers to expose the entire conspiracy. Senator Brian Gaines had been posthumously stripped of his position and benefits. Darren House's defense contracts had been terminated. The Castellano crime family had been dismantled by federal agents. 23 Echo Division veterans had been avenged. But David's work wasn't finished. His encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message. "New intelligence. 3 additional targets identified. Request immediate consultation." The message was from Santiago, who had established himself as a freelance intelligence broker. After the Meridian incident, David typed back, "Location, Safe House, Prague, District 2. 1 hour." David finished his coffee and walked through the narrow cobblestone streets of the old city. Prague had become his base of operations, a city where cash transactions were common and questions were rarely asked. He'd established several identities here, each supported by carefully crafted backgrounds and documentation. The Safe House was a centuries-old building that had been converted into apartments. Santiago was waiting in a room on the 3rd floor, surrounded by computer equipment and surveillance monitors. "You look different," Santiago observed as David entered. David had changed considerably over the past 6 months. His hair was shorter, his build leaner from constant training. Most noticeably, His eyes had hardened into something that would make most people uncomfortable. The factory worker, David Mathis, was truly dead now, replaced by something more primal and dangerous. "What do you have?" David asked, settling into a chair. Santiago activated a large monitor, displaying photographs and files. 3 people who were involved in the Echo Division elimination program but weren't at the Meridian building that night. The first photograph showed a woman in her 50s with gray hair and professional attire. Viola Donovan, former CIA section chief. She was the one who originally identified Echo Division veterans as potential security risks. Retired last year with full honors, currently living in Switzerland. The second image was of a younger man in a military uniform. Colonel Will Ellis, Pentagon Intelligence Liaison. He provided logistical support for the elimination operations, including cover stories and false documentation. Currently assigned to European Command in Germany. The third photograph made David's jaw tighten. It showed a man in his 60s with silver hair and a distinguished bearing, Senator Tej Ingren, chairman of the Armed Services Committee. He authorized the black budget funding that paid for the entire program, still in office, still voting on military appropriations. David studied the files for several minutes. Why weren't they at the celebration? Donovan was traveling in Europe. Ellis was attending a NATO conference in Brussels. Ingram was at a campaign fundraiser in his home state. Lucky for them, or maybe they suspected something and stayed away deliberately. David considered this possibility. The 3 targets were all high-ranking officials with decades of experience in intelligence operations. It was possible they'd detected signs that their conspiracy was compromised and chosen not to attend the Meridian meeting. What's their current status? Donovan is living in a villa outside Geneva, supposedly retired but maintaining contact with several intelligence networks. Ellis has been reassigned to a desk job but still has access to classified operational files. Ingram is running for re-election and maintaining his committee positions. David leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. These 3 people knew he was alive and active. They'd probably been expecting retaliation since the Meridian incident. They would be prepared, protected, and dangerous. I need current intelligence on their security arrangements, daily routines, and vulnerabilities. Already working on it, Santiago replied. But David, these aren't like the others. They're not criminals or contractors looking to make money. They're career intelligence professionals with government resources and decades of experience. Going after them will be exponentially more dangerous. They participated in murdering my colleagues. That makes them fair targets. Santiago nodded, having expected this response. Viola Donovan first. Why? She's the most isolated and potentially the most vulnerable, but she's also the most knowledgeable about Echo Division operations. If anyone knows about additional surviving operatives, it would be her. David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Prague skyline. Set up surveillance on all 3 targets. I want to know everything about their lives, their habits, their fears. David turned back to Santiago, and his friend saw something in his eyes that made him unconsciously step backward. Then I'm going to remind them why Echo Division operatives were considered the most dangerous men in the world. Over the next 3 weeks, David conducted intensive reconnaissance on his targets. Viola Donovan's villa in Switzerland was a fortress surrounded by private security and sophisticated surveillance systems. Colonel Ellis lived on a U.S. military base in Germany, protected by Army security protocols and never traveled alone. Senator Ingram was constantly surrounded by Secret Service protection and rarely appeared in public without advanced security sweeps. All 3 had clearly been expecting retaliation and had taken appropriate precautions. But David had advantages they couldn't anticipate. His Echo Division training had included infiltration techniques that weren't taught to regular military or intelligence personnel. More importantly, he had resources they didn't know about, other former operatives who'd survived the elimination program by going completely underground. On a Thursday night in November, David received a coded message at a dead drop location in Vienna. The message contained a single phrase: "The wolves are gathering." It was a signal he'd been hoping to receive for months. Somewhere out there, other Echo Division veterans had survived the conspiracy and were ready to fight back. The next morning, David traveled to an abandoned warehouse outside the city. Inside, he found 3 men waiting for him, faces he recognized from his time in Echo Division. "Echo 42 reporting," said the first man, a tall, scarred veteran named Ross Hoff. "Echo 999 operational." added the second, a compact, dangerously looking operative called Javier Kramer. Echo 13, ready for orders, concluded the third man. Someone, David remembered as Toby Lynn. David felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since the factory. A sense of belonging, of brotherhood. These men had survived the same betrayal he had, lost the same colleagues, suffered the same losses. How? David asked. Roshoff answered. We've been watching each other's backs since the elimination started. When Santiago put out feelers through the old networks, we decided it was time to make contact. Are there others? Maybe, Javier said. We've identified 3 additional possibles, but they've gone so deep underground, we can't be sure they're still alive. David briefed them on the 3 remaining targets and his plans for dealing with them. The other operatives listened without comment, absorbing the tactical details and preparing for what they all knew would be their final mission. This isn't about revenge anymore, David concluded. It's about ensuring that what happened to our colleagues never happens to anyone else. Toby Lynn nodded grimly. The wolves are gathering, brother, and it's hunting season. For the first time in months, David smiled genuinely. He wasn't alone anymore. He had his pack back, and they had prey to hunt. The 3 targets who thought they'd escaped justice were about to learn that Echo Division operatives never forgot their own. And when they hunted together, nothing could stop them. The final phase of the reckoning was about to begin. The operation began at dawn on December 15th, with 4 Echo Division veterans launching simultaneous strikes across 3 countries. It was the kind of coordinated assault that had made their unit legendary in the intelligence community. Precise, overwhelming, and absolutely lethal. In Switzerland, David approached Viola Donovan's villa through the morning mist. His movements invisible to the sophisticated surveillance systems that Roshoff had compromised from a location 2 miles away. The private security team never saw him coming. In Germany, Javier Kramer infiltrated the U.S. military base where Colonel Will Ellis was stationed. Using credentials that had been carefully forged to show him as a Pentagon inspector conducting a surprise security audit, in Washington, D.C., Toby Lynn positioned himself outside the hotel where Senator Ted Ingram was staying for committee hearings, blending seamlessly with the crowd of lobbyists and political operatives who filled the city streets. All 3 targets had been living in fear for months, expecting retaliation but never knowing when or how it would come. Their paranoia had made them predictable, following rigid security protocols that actually made them easier to track. David was the first to reach his target. Viola Donovan was having breakfast on her villa's terrace when David materialized from the shadows like a ghost. Her bodyguards were unconscious or dead, their radio communications severed. She was completely alone with the man she'd helped mark for death. "Hello, Viola," David said calmly, settling into the chair across from her. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Donovan's hand moved slowly toward the pistol she kept in her purse. But David's own weapon was already pointed at her chest. "I wouldn't," he said. "We need to have a conversation first." "You're supposed to be dead," she whispered. "A lot of people are supposed to be dead. 23 Echo Division operatives, for instance. But somehow, they all died while I'm still here. Funny how that worked out." Donovan straightened in her chair, trying to project the authority she'd once wielded as a CIA section chief. "You can't prove anything. The Meridian investigation cleared me of any involvement. The investigation cleared you because you weren't at the celebration, but I have Lon McLachlan's files. Remember every email you sent, every operation you authorized, every Echo operative you marked for elimination." David placed a tablet on the table between them, displaying pages of classified documents. "You want to see the order you signed authorizing my assassination? It's quite detailed. Subject represents significant security risk due to operational knowledge and psychological profile. Recommend immediate termination using spouse-based infiltration protocol." Donovan's face went pale as she read her own words. "That was classified at the highest levels? How did you? Because I'm very good at what I do, Viola, and what I do is eliminate threats to national security, which brings us to our current situation." David's phone buzzed with a text message. "Target 2 secured. Awaiting instructions." Another buzz. "Target 3 in custody. Ready for final phase." David showed Donovan the messages. "My colleagues have just captured Colonel Ellis and Senator Ingram. All 3 architects of the Echo Division elimination program are now in our custody. What do you want?" "The same thing I wanted from everyone else involved in this conspiracy, the truth." David activated the tablet's recording function. Tell me about the other operations. Tell me about the foreign intelligence connections. Tell me about the politicians and contractors who weren't at the Meridian building. For the next hour, Viola Donovan provided a complete confession, detailing a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of the U.S. government and involved intelligence agencies from 4 different countries. The Echo Division elimination program had been just one component of a larger effort to control and eliminate independent military assets. When she finished, David uploaded the recording to secure servers in 12 different countries, ensuring that the information could never be suppressed or destroyed. What happens now? Donovan asked. Now you pay the price for murdering my friends. David's phone rang. It was Santiago calling from Prague. All 3 confessions have been uploaded and distributed, Santiago reported. The intelligence community is in complete chaos. 6 different investigations have been launched, and there are rumors of congressional hearings. Good. Any word on the other possible survivors? Yes, actually. 2 more Echo operatives have made contact through the old networks. They're requesting extraction and protection. David smiled. 2 more of his colleagues had survived the purge, bringing the total to at least 6 Echo Division veterans who'd escaped the conspiracy's reach. What about our current situation? You have maybe 6 hours before every intelligence agency in the world starts hunting you. The confessions you obtained implicate people at the highest levels of government. Understood. David ended the call and looked at Viola Donovan. It's time to go, Viola. Somewhere you can think about the 23 men you helped murder. Somewhere you can consider the consequences of betraying people who served their country with honor. David escorted Donovan to a vehicle where Rosshoff was waiting. Similar scenes were playing out in Germany and Washington, D.C., as Colonel Ellis and Senator Ingram were transported to a location where they would face final judgment. The abandoned monastery in the Czech mountains had been chosen carefully, remote, defensible, and completely off the grid. It was here that the 4 Echo operatives brought their prisoners for the final phase of their mission. The 3 architects of the Echo Division elimination program were secured in separate cells, each one soundproof and escape-proof. They had confessed to their crimes, provided evidence of the broader conspiracy, and identified additional targets. For future operations, now they would face the same fate they had imposed on 23 loyal operatives. Any last words? David asked Viola Donovan as he prepared the injection. She looked at him with a mixture of fear and defiance. You think this makes you a hero? You're just another killer. Maybe, David replied, but I'm a killer who keeps his promises. I promised my dead colleagues that their murders would be avenged. Promise kept. The injection was quick and painless, more mercy than Donovan's victims had received. Similar scenes played out in the adjacent cells as the other 3 operatives administered justice to Colonel Ellis and Senator Ingram. When it was over, the 4 Echo Division veterans stood outside the monastery, looking up at stars visible through the clear mountain air. What now? Rosshoff asked. David considered the question. The immediate threat had been eliminated, but Santiago's intelligence suggested that other conspiracies were already forming. There would always be people who believed they could use and discard military assets without consequences. Now, we do what Echo Division has always done, David replied. We hunt the monsters that hide in the shadows. We protect the people who can't protect themselves. And we make sure that anyone who thinks about betraying America's warriors knows exactly what will happen to them. Javier Kramer nodded. The wolves are back in business. But we do it differently this time, David continued. No government oversight, no political interference, no civilian casualties. We hunt only those who deserve it. Over the next several days, the 4 operatives established a new organization, a private intelligence and enforcement network funded by assets they'd recovered from their targets. They recruited other surviving Echo Division veterans, expanded their capabilities, and began identifying new threats. The world's intelligence agencies never found the bodies of Viola Donovan, Colonel Ellis, or Senator Ingram. The official investigation concluded that they had fled the country to avoid prosecution for their roles in the conspiracy. But in the shadows, a new legend began to spread. Stories of men who appeared without warning, who could not be bought or intimidated, who hunted those who preyed on the innocent. Stories of operatives marked with the symbol of a serpent coiled around a dagger. David Mathis, the factory worker who just wanted a quiet life with his wife, was truly dead now. What had emerged from that betrayal was something far more dangerous, a man who'd found his true purpose in protecting others from the kind of betrayal he'd suffered. The mark of the serpent and dagger was no longer just a tattoo. It had become a promise, a warning, and a guarantee of justice for those who thought they were untouchable. And in the darkness where Redditors hunted, Echo 77 and his pack were watching, waiting, ready to remind anyone who needed the lesson that some betrayals carried a price that could never be avoided or forgotten. The reckoning was complete, but the hunt would continue forever. Epilogue. 1 year later, David stood on a cliff overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, reading a newspaper headline. Congressional investigation exposes massive intelligence conspiracy. The Echo Division elimination program had been fully exposed, resulting in resignations, prosecutions, and a complete overhaul of military intelligence oversight. His phone buzzed with a message from Santiago. New target identified. Former CIA director involved in human trafficking network. Interested? David looked at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Send details." Some people never learned that certain lines should never be crossed. But David and his pack were always ready to teach them. The hunt continued.